On this day, the 19th of December 1946, the First Indo-China War officially begins. Indochina was a French territory and had been French since the time of Napoleon III. It had had many French interested parties in Vietnam before. There had been missionaries, traders, there had been people in the ports, like in China later on. But it had been French for well over a century, completely French. The Second World War was a disaster for European colonies and European power in the Far East and Southeast Asia. The Japanese had come in, they had conquered, they had removed or replaced the Europeans, and they had inspired the locals because they saw other Asians kicking out the Europeans, something they didn't think could happen before this. Although the Japanese usually didn't keep the favorability of the locals for very long because they were quite brutal in their occupation. Much more brutal than the powers that they removed. French Indochina was a little bit different because it had been occupied previously. The Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, the Philippines, they had been occupied after the 8th of December 1941. French Indochina had been occupied previous to this. After the fall of France in 1940, France was in a weak position. It was on its knees. The Japanese requested, but demanded really, that the French allow Japanese troops into the northern part of Vietnam. The excuse was they wanted to stop weapons and materials going to China. Very quickly they occupied the entirety of French Indochina. It is quite obvious to most people that the reason they occupied the south was because they were planning on an advance in to the European colonies of Southeast Asia. As we all know, the war did not go well for Japan, and in 1945, Japan surrendered. This left millions of Japanese troops in Southeast Asia still occupying territory. They hadn't been defeated or expelled, they were left stranded. Japan was defeated, and they were far from home. In some places, the Dutch East Indies, as well as French Indochina, the local Japanese allowed the local independence fellas to take weapons, go into their stash and take all their weapons, because the Japanese, I suppose they were thinking it was kind of revenge for their defeat, possibly. Perhaps some of them actually genuinely supported their independence moves. Maybe they were thinking long term, or maybe they just didn't care anymore. The fact they were defeated maybe it demoralized them. I'm not sure, but the locals in Vietnam and in Dutch East Indies were able to go in, and they were able to stock up on a lot of weapons that would help them in the years ahead in their wars of independence. The Japanese in Indochina surrendered initially to the British and the Chinese. The Chinese occupied the northern part of Vietnam. They didn't really bother with Laos or Cambodia at the time. and the British occupied Saigon in the south. Ho Chi Minh had declared the independence of Vietnam on the 2nd of September 1945, the same day as the Japanese officially signed the surrender in Tokyo Harbor. He made an appeal to Harry Truman, talking about how the French were demanding this, that, and the other, and that he had declared independence, and he was begging the American president for assistance. Truman ignored that. And maybe he shouldn't have. But anyway, so the Chinese occupied the northern parts of Vietnam just after Ho Chi Minh had declared independence. This ended his short period of being in control of the Tonkin part of Vietnam. The Tonkin part is the northern part around Hanoi. And he had been in charge with his Viet Minh communists. Once the Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists had occupied Hanoi, he wasn't really in power anymore, the Chinese were. And so he couldn't really talk about socialism or communism. That wouldn't have been good for him, because Chiang Kai-shek did not like communists. Although Chiang Kai-shek, he flirted with lots of socialist ideas. He wasn't against socialism, he was against communism. There was a group as well in Vietnam that were very similar to the Chinese nationalists, and they wanted like a social republic in Vietnam, and so they were cooperating with the Chinese occupation in the north of Vietnam. Now, very soon, in 1946, the French were coming back. They relieved the British in Saigon, and they also landed in the north of Vietnam, Tonkin, to take over from the Chinese. Now, before they actually landed, the Chinese had already withdrawn. This left Ho Chi Minh again in charge of the Tonkin area of Vietnam, and during that time he massacred the Vietnamese nationalists. Just wiped them out, because that was a good time to do it. The French had said that there was going to be some sort of deal, that Vietnam would be part of the French Union, that they would have autonomy. Now, Ho Chi Minh didn't want this, but like he said, and this is recorded in the Ho Chi Minh Museum in Hanoi, he said, "I would rather sniff French shit for the next few years rather than eat Chinese shit for the rest of my life." Vietnamese don't like China very much. Historical reasons. So, French landed at Haiphong, Haiphong, Haiphong. That must, I don't know how to pronounce these things. So, they landed at Haiphong, and they were negotiating with the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh were not very happy with what the French wanted. Basically, just occupy the place again. They occupied Da Nang as well, which apparently they shouldn't have been doing because of the agreement they made. And the French decided to bombard the port. Now, this killed about 6,000 Vietnamese. The Viet Minh then withdrew from the city, and they went back to Hanoi. The French then occupied Hanoi and areas around it, and there was an uneasy peace between the Viet Minh and the French. This is when, on the night of the 19th of December 1946, Viet Minh forces set off explosives just after 8 o'clock in the evening. They had smuggled explosives past French army guards into the city's power plant. This plunged Hanoi into darkness, and then the Viet Minh began attacking military positions and French homes, so French people. And in darkness, well, it'd be much more difficult for the French to resist and to see who's doing what and who's firing at them. So, good strategy. Now, obviously the French fought back, and they gradually gained control again. They went around and killed the Viet Minh. They started shelling parts of the city. They went searching house to house for anyone they thought might be Viet Minh. Ho Chi Minh and the other generals ordered all their soldiers to go into battle and destroy the invaders, but they had to withdraw. They couldn't resist. They couldn't resist the French, overwhelming French superiority. Now, it started on this day, but the French gaining control of Hanoi and the area around it took a while. It took 2 months for them to gain complete control. But by the time they were done, the Viet Minh had been destroyed, scattered, or they had fled into the hills 80 miles north of Hanoi. This was the beginning of the first Indo-China war between the French and the Viet Minh. Well, not just the French and people who were loyal to them, and the Viet Minh. This war would go on until 1955. The Second Indochina War, or what we know as the Vietnam War, would begin around the same time and continue up until 1975. So from 1946 until 1975, there was almost non-stop conflict, war, terrorism in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And it began on this day, the 19th of December, 1946. If you like these videos, come back tomorrow for more. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment.